So we're going to get started. And welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied fields related to the built environment. And today we have challenges and pre-approved building plans with Jennifer Krouse, Allison Thurmond Quinlin, and Edward Erfurt. And I will be interviewing and moderating this session. My name is Robert Steuteville. So share your thoughts on hashtag on the park bench, www.tinyurl.com/OTPB And save the date. Registration will be opening soon for CNU 32 in Cincinnati, Ohio on May 15th through 18th, 2024. This historic river city has rebuilt its urban core, harnessing its own diversity to overcome adversity. Learn more at cnu.org/CNU32. And today we have a panel of folks who know a lot about what is going on with pre-approved building plans, a concept that many cities and towns are pursuing to improve design and reduce costs, among other reasons. Jennifer Krouse is founder and CEO of Liberty House Plans, which is set up to, quote, give the best architects a safe place to publish their work. Previously, she served as a business advisor who specialized in companies that shape the built environment. Allison Thurmond Quinlin is the founder and principal architect and landscape architect with Flintlock Lab, and Lab stands for Landscape Architecture and Building. It is a multidisciplinary consulting firm for design and construction based in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Edward Erfurt is the Director of Community Action at Strong Towns. He's a trained architect and passionate urban designer with over 20 years of public and private sector experience. I'm Rob Steuteville, editor of CNU's Public Square. And today's discussion is all about the exciting trend toward pre-approved building plans and the challenges in getting that done at the municipal level and perhaps other levels. First, there's going to be a presentation followed by a brief discussion among the panelists and Q&A from the audience. Please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. And I'm going to hand this over to Jen, who's going to talk first.
Okay, let's see how this sharing goes. Okay, how's that look?
Looks good to me.
Okay, great. So here's a little agenda for the next 10 minutes. This is going to be really quick, but don't worry because the session is being recorded. I will describe a few surface level challenges that we face and have faced with pre-reviewed plans, but I want to leave other challenges for the Q&A so we can spend time on your particular concerns. So if there's a challenge or a question that you have, just note it down and we will get to that. So what's the problem we have? We have a housing crisis. Quite simply, there's a gap between the supply of homes and the number of households that want homes. That gap creates competition that drives up home prices and rents. And we know this because it's in the news, but it also can be seen in hard numbers. There are a number of different estimates out there, and this is one of the more conservative from Realtor.com. According to Realtor.com, at the end of 2022, the US had a housing deficit of almost 2.3 million homes. And this gets worse every year because we're not even meeting the current rate of new household formation with the homes that we build. So in the best year of the last 5 years, we built about 98% of the homes that we needed for the additional households that formed that year. But we also had a year when we built only 3 homes for every 4 new households that formed. When looking for solutions to the situation, the demand side of the equation isn't something we have a lot of influence over. So we focus on the supply side. And there we have 2 forces that pre-reviewed building plans can address. One is regulatory friction, and another is home builder productivity. When I say home builder productivity, I mean things like How long does it take to get through pre-development? And when I say regulatory friction, I mean things like zoning that suppresses the potential of a given piece of land, or perhaps procedural delays that are often embedded in clunky approval processes for new home development. This deficit that we're seeing is not a problem everywhere in the US, but it is endemic. In Spokane, a city that Liberty House Plans is working with, housing was already constrained before the pandemic hit, and the pandemic migration from larger cities bumped up the population and pushed the deficit over the edge. The good news in this situation is that housing pressure created a very clear mandate for city leadership to do what they could to remove constraints on housing supply. They passed an interim ordinance, informally known as BOCA, that included a really bold measure among the measures that it included. This bold measure was that as long as the ordinance was in effect, you could build up to and including 4 units on any residentially zoned land in the city. The primary goal of BOCA was to expedite housing production by making it easier to build within the existing footprint of the city. It enables traditional housing types that had been suppressed. The challenge is this: in the US, we don't regulate for architectural beauty. So what happens when you pop the cork on building types that Americans aren't used to seeing in new construction? And builders put up designs that are not a treat to the eye. So there's a very real risk in that situation that members of the public will associate these building types with junk. And that creates friction for good examples of these building types that could get built to relieve the housing crisis. City leaders in Spokane recognize this, and that includes Spencer Gardner and Dean Gunderson in the planning department. So they have dedicated funds to develop a collection of context-sensitive building plans that they would have their building official review proactively. Once a plan is reviewed, a builder who incorporates that plan into their project will get expedited review, a shorter pre-development timeline, and greater predictability for their project because the architectural review is complete. So here's their program in a nutshell. For those of you who didn't hear me talk about it at CNU, Spokane has selected stock plans from the collection that Liberty House Plans publishes. A city can commission custom design for pre-approved plan programs, but we offer stock plans that worked for Spokane and would enable their budget to stretch farther. Once these plans make it through the review process, we are referring to them as pre-reviewed. This avoids some confusion that arose initially when we were referring to the designs as pre-approved. The architecture has been reviewed, but the project as a whole, including the site design, must still be approved. Lastly, while the city of Spokane is managing the parts of the process that are normal municipal competencies, Liberty House Plans is managing the parts of the program that aren't. So for instance, intellectual property rights management, publication of the plans online, order taking, licensing of the plans to builders, and distribution of the construction documents. This program faces some potential pitfalls that are common to pre-reviewed plan programs that we have seen so far. The one that's not discussed often enough, in my opinion, is that pre-reviewed building plan programs require the planning department to choose a set of designs. And that sounds simple, but it means that they have to place a bet on what designs builders will undertake and succeed with, because if they don't succeed, they won't continue to build these plans and we won't solve the problem we're here to address. So there are ways to reduce the risk of making a wrong choice, but it's never zero. Secondly, when a town establishes a set of pre-reviewed plans, they may be asking builders to take a chance on building types and designs that are out of their comfort zone and that they haven't built up any construction efficiency with. And that represents a real financial risk for builders. So the programs need to be attractive enough to bring the builders across the threshold. Lastly, pre-reviewed building plan programs put municipal operations under a microscope. So if there's a hitch in the town's building review process or it's clunky, trying to set up a pre-approval program will uncover that and make it visible to all. Now, some would say that's a feature, not a bug. And I would say Dean Gunderson is one of those. He told me the other day that it's worth it to discover the things that work or would slow down or stop someone from building. Because if you're a town dealing with a housing emergency, you really need to get your act together as a regulator to make sure that you're not the one getting in the way. Okay, so what's next? On the 1st of March, that's our target date for rolling out the first design in the Spokane collection. On March 1st, Liberty House Plans will also be releasing a guidebook. This is a sort of general audience guidebook, the Citizen's Guide to Pre-Approved House Plans. So if someone in the community is interested in learning more about how it works and why it works, then they could buy the book. We don't have a date for this yet, but the city of Spokane is also composing a development guidebook, and that guidebook will serve as both a catalog to the plans that will be included in the pre-reviewed plan collection, but also a guidebook on the development process in the city. And it's especially geared towards emerging developers, so people who might be willing to take on these duplexes, fourplexes, and townhomes that are part of the collection. They want to grow the construction cohort in the community. And the guidebook will include things like siting strategies for those designs on the typical lot sizes that are represented in Spokane. The rollout will continue with additional designs as they're added to the pre-approved plan collection. And like I said, these will be starting with duplexes, fourplexes, and townhomes. But there is some talk of expanding to accessory dwelling units because members of city council are also interested in that, and they can also help address the crisis. The state of Washington has now passed similar legislation to the city's BOCA program. And so the city is looking to consolidate the provisions of that state legislation with their own provisions and make these a permanent part of the local regulatory structure. And then throughout this process, we will be working together to measure the results of the program and adjust as necessary so that it's effective. And it's particularly important because this is still a somewhat sort of uncharted territory. There are programs reaching as far back as 2014 that I know of that are no longer in existence, municipal programs for pre-approved plans. And so we want to learn what's going to work and avoid the pitfalls of the past. So we will have Q&A afterwards, but if you don't get to speak during the Q&A or you want to talk with me more later, please feel free to give me a shout, jen@libertyhouseplans.com, and I will look forward to hearing what you have to say and what you'd like to know.
All right, I think I'm hopping in next. Hi guys, I am Alli Thurmond Quinlin. I'm in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I'm an architect and a landscape architect, and then I'm also a small developer. Did some time on our planning commission here, and I also work with the Incremental Development Alliance, and generally have an ethos that we're trying to build lovable, sustainable, walkable, dense places so that we can save productive and sensitive ecosystems from sprawl. And so we come at that work from nearly every angle, but we also have an incredible focus on projects and advocacy towards that goal. We've been using this little silly graphic to explain kind of how all of these different specialities work together to get housing units on the ground at scale. So the complexity of producing housing in our current housing system is really the thing that you should take away from how many different elements we've had to slowly add to be successful at incremental development. So one of the things that we, as you know, the names of this has changed a lot because kind of this big picture idea, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But generally, the other way that we approach this work is with what we would call stock plans and pattern books, right? That we're working with repeat developers, building the same plans repeatedly in different markets with different elevations. And so we've gotten at this idea of how do we produce additional housing units by some efficiency of rebuilding the same unit? We know how many 2x4s are in it. We've tweaked all the things that were wrong the first time. And we can talk through some of the limitations of these kinds of programs by having been working on this idea for a while. So as Jennifer said, we've seen a range of communities adopt some sort of this kind of program nationally under a variety of different names since 2014. And we have an even wider pool of cities that have adopted some sort of ADU version. California now is required to have a pre-approved ADU code. So this is just a short list of the municipalities that have those up and on them. So I'm coming at you from Northwest Arkansas. And we also started with ADUs for our pre-approved ideas. We started with the idea of a fully pre-approved ADU plans program in 2017. On a project that was with Robert Sharp and John Massingale, and I worked on this as a Walton Family Foundation grant. We really quickly moved to calling it pre-reviewed ADU plans, getting to actual approval from more than one municipality. We hit what a lot of cities have hit as a challenge really early on. One of the things that I can kind of bring forward, even if the plans have been pre-reviewed, it feels in practice almost impossible to actually not have additional permit comments, even on pre-reviewed plans, right? The concept of this should be we're reducing labor at the city office level, that they've had one chance to really fully review and okay and get the details right the way that they want them on these building plans. The building sections are right. We've really got it honed in, and we've done that once. And then you can come in, you've got your building permit set, you can walk in same day. The goal of this program was you can walk in same day, pay $50, have your set of plans, get your building permit that day, as long as you have a site plan that works. That was really where we started. And I can provide the feedback, having built the same house plan in a municipality more than 10 times. We sometimes get different comments on the same set of drawings from the same reviewer month to month. And so the idea that we're going to be able to really widespread, get multiple building departments to fully sign off on a plan and not want to review it again has been one of those. In concept works great. We've had no success whatsoever with that. So we sort of then moved to pre-reviewed and then sort of settled on model ADU plans for this program specifically. So part of the project was helping advocate for and pass new ADU codes in 3 of the cities in our municipality, and then provide free plans. We'll talk a little bit about the licensing challenges in these programs. This program specifically was done on a perpetual non-exclusive license that is owned by a housing nonprofit that was the client of this project. So that nonprofit, which owns and manages affordable housing in the region, owns the license to those, and they sell the plans. So they've also taken on the liability. So we have, several different ways that cities have licensed and done royalties and intellectual property, and who owns the liability, who owns the kind of financial gain from the sale of the plans. This one specifically was geared towards providing affordable housing, and so there's no royalty structure on it. The designers were paid slightly more than you typically would have been for the upfront designs, and then they can be used kind of infinitely locally. We also did an example cottage court, a little muse court that the houses are built as affordable housing, and then they're available for tours. So, as we get into the terminology, kind of some of the ways of talking that through, the terminology that we use really is reflective of what we're trying to achieve with these programs. The other pre-reviewed program that we're working on right now is in British Columbia. We're sort of just now moving into release of that program and out of NDA, so I didn't include any slides about it, but I was in Vancouver last week talking through the province of British Columbia released December 7th. Single-family zoning on sewer systems in municipalities in British Columbia is being phased out, and all of their towns with a sewer system are required to update their zoning by midsummer to allow up to 4 units on any lot in a municipality that has access to sewer. Any lot that is also on a transit corridor has to be allowed to have up to 6 units. And so we've been working on a pre-reviewed program for them as an advisor, trying to put together really strategizing and structuring on a municipal coordinated province-wide basis. How do we get to a level of what they are calling pre-reviewed plans, short of getting every building department in the province together on a council to review plans? There's not a smooth way to actually execute what the goal of these programs is, which is to reduce the design effort and reduce the review effort, both from the developer side, from the architect side, and from the city an admin office, right? One of the things that we're seeing on permit holdups in terms of housing production is the amount of time it takes reviewers to review at individual plans, often multiple times. And so these programs are really designed to reduce that labor at every level. And so we've ended up with a number of different names. We've also got a pattern zones approach, which shout out to the pattern zones team. I know you guys have a couple of people on the call, which is trying to implement the same idea via zoning, that you have different areas of town that in your zone, you can build a certain number of plans, and that we're tying that form-based idea to plan specific. We also have a lot of people practicing more of a stock plans approach that is for private clients. It's not for municipalities. But that is the place that I would say we see the most actual work and kind of housing units coming online in this idea, which is there are several developers and designers, especially in the CNU world, that have stock plans of catalogs of plans that they know and they like, and they've worked them out, and they've got a couple of elevations for them, and you can mix and match, and that they know that they work. The reason I think that private side version of this is worth talking through too is that those stock plan catalogs tend to be really honed down to sales, marketability, constructability, and cost versus value. One of the things that we've seen as a big limitation in some of these programs nationally is that you'll end up with a catalog of 10 plans and only one of them is being built because only one of them actually pencils and is marketable. So I think that's one of the things to really work through with builders early on in a program is, can these plans be built, marketed, and sold at a price point that makes sense for people? If not, then it's likely that we won't see widespread adoption. Plans catalogs are another way that we've seen this implemented, which I think in my experience has been more about cities trying to explain to developers and builders the kinds of plans that they want to see, things that will be more likely to be favorably looked at by a city. And I think it's important to note that one of the ways that these programs can work is as a communication tool by cities about what they want to see, and as an educational tool to neighbors about what the kinds of housing that might feel scary can look like. These are, housing types we have not been developing since 1960s zoning made them widely illegal. And so there are lots of very lovable versions of these kinds of products that we aren't necessarily familiar with as a general population. And so even if we don't have widespread adoption of some of these specific plans being built, I think they can be really successful in terms of opening kind of mindset and expanding views of what kinds of housing we might be seeing under some new zoning practices, under some new coding practices. One of the big hangups that we've seen in terms of the structural implementation of these programs is who owns the designs. So city-owned designs that the city is collecting the payment for those plans, they may or may not come with a royalty to original designers. The biggest benefit here is that the city is then taking on the liability for these. And so often a city-owned design program is going to have a much smaller catalog. Versus we, especially in California, are seeing a lot more architect-owned designs, which is more of a widespread program that an architect can submit a design to be approved and included. It allows for a much broader catalog. And then the architect themselves owns it. There's often then a fee structure that is posted, right? So you're submitting your set of plans, it's included in the catalog. This is the way a lot of the California programs are running. And then there's a posted royalty that you're paying directly to the architect to use that plan. One of the limitations we're also going to flag here, and as we did our pre-calls, I was explaining to everybody else that I thought I was going to be on here, is the dreams killer of all the problems in these programs that we've seen. One of the problems that we have seen implemented in this, even in private stock plan work, is it's almost impossible to get someone to take an actual stock plan and build it with no changes. And really defining within your program what level of changes are allowed while it's still being considered a stock plan, or a pre-reviewed plan, or what amount of changes and wall moves and bathroom layout changes can happen before the plan is changed too much, and how are we structuring in who is making those changes and how the decisions are made. Psychologically, we have found it's very difficult, even for developers, to not want to tweak plans from the starting place. And so I think flagging that as a reality and then building some flexibility into the system as you're implementing one of these programs can be helpful. One of the last problems I want to flag here is the range of quality of the plans that we see in them, right? You saw lots of really beautiful images from Jennifer, and one of the way that their program works is that it's all good architecture. If you look through the actual adopted pre-approved programs nationally and internationally now in Canada, there's a really wide range of quality, right? There are some of these that we're really excited to see built 10 times, and there's some of them that are designed apparently by someone who's never lived in or built a house. And some of them that we would be very sad if they were built, 10 in a row on your block. And so one of the things that is also a challenge is a city figuring out what means by which they implement quality control, and really what the goals are and the consistency, and finding that balance between, I bet the one on the lower left is going to pencil, and I bet it's going to not make neighbors excited about ADUs, right? So how do we really get to what success in these programs looks like? And I wanted to throw in a set of data that I bet you guys have heard me talk about before, but I think it's the most important information about why the housing market is such a challenge right now, as somebody who tries to build a lot of housing. So as we talked about that challenge of numbers of households relative to numbers of houses, it's really important to talk about that the most common household type in America is one person living alone. It's about a third of households. The next common household type is a couple with no children. So about 58% of Americans are sleeping in a single bedroom at night, unless someone snores, is the joke, that usually gets thrown in there. But we're still thinking about planning as a country as though dwelling units equates to a family of 5. And a full 72% of American household units cater to nuclear families that are a real minority of households. So one of the things that this program can do is really start to provide realistic options and suggestions about how to house the actual households that we have, which is lots of individual households in very small, envelopes, which really skews a lot of our zoning, which is limited by density, right? So our houses here, right, our households are skewing small, our houses are skewing really large. We have this big mismatch. And one of the things that this program can do is show, as we have smaller households, we need more individual units to house the same number of people. And so we can start to show how we can house people creatively in a way that doesn't feel scary. And I think that even if we don't have widespread adoption of the individual plans, starting to show the way that repeatable house types can house people in a way that is not scary to neighbors, it can be really helpful in moving the ball forward in a community. Location on these matters. We've found that, cuteness matters a lot. And so the architectural quality that's incorporated here really is a key component of preventing backlash against the increasing movement towards allowing more density, allowing smaller units within a city. Okay, I think we've got plenty more to talk about today, so I will stop share here.
Great, Alli. Well, I get the opportunity to kind of react to some of these things. What I can tell you, and I can tell by the interest of this webinar, every city hall that Strong Towns is visiting across North America has an interest in pre-approved building plans. We have a housing crisis. We need more houses. We want better houses. We want houses that accommodate the residents that live in our communities. When I look at the pre-approved building plans, this is an incredible response to that crisis. And we have incredible folks working on it that are making it look really easy. This isn't easy. And I think you heard that from both Allie and Jennifer, where when you go out to, I worked in a small community where we had 3 building departments from 3 different jurisdictions within a block of each other. It didn't matter what was received by those building officials, same building code, each had their own way to review, each had their own comments and would never comment the same way twice. That is something we see in city halls. When you layer it on and you work within city halls, you realize how complex we've made the system. So if you try to get, just as a resident, to try to go get a deck or a fence put in, you realize there's 3 or 4 different people you have to talk to at City Hall that may not be in the same building. The building industry, the large market producers of homes, these are the ones that have the freeway signs that offer the first-time home buyer and they want to get you in. They have adopted a system and they've developed a system that's taken many, many years that allows them to streamline permitting. Working in a jurisdiction where you see the same units coming in again and again, I know from experience that you could approve some of those homes at a municipal level in a matter of hours, within a day, because you've seen the same plan 50 times. It's got all the right details in it. What I'm finding most interesting with the pre-approved building plans, and this is for anybody that wants to apply this in their own local areas, is this alignment of City Hall that occurs when you look at pre-approved building plans. That all of that regulatory friction, when City Hall realizes that that's their problem, that it is a self-imposed problem, the pre-approved building plans, other than any other program I've seen, brings that to light immediately. Because when you have the site planners and you have the building official and the fire marshal and utility company all at the table looking at the same plans with the common mission to develop a house product in your community, the game changes. When you start to realize that all those conflicts within the code can be addressed at the table to build consensus behind a plan that is approved and believed by your community. So this idea of aligning City Hall to work through all that friction is super important. And in the cities that are applying this, the ones that are sitting at the table and going through every bit of that, all the way through to know that they could repeat the process in a very fast way, that everybody is on board with the minimal amount of variables to it, is a huge win in the pre-approved building plan world. The other component to this is that the house types that you are being shown and that are really coming through with pre-approved building plans are the ones that are less familiar in our communities. They're the things like the accessory dwelling units. They're the multifamily units that Alli showed in her presentation. It's the duplexes that Jennifer showed that were in these communities. And unfortunately, residents in communities only remember the bad ones. They only remember the ugly ones. They forget that the good ones are actually already existing within their community. The pre-approved building plans, when you get all the brain damage out of the way, when you streamline this for the community, you can show high quality architecture that is consistent within your community. And even communities that are right next to each other or relatively close, like South Bend and Kalamazoo, Michigan, initially you look at those pre-approved plans that both communities have, they're actually vastly different because you're able to go and look at characteristics that are familiar within a neighborhood. So if you're trying to introduce this idea of something other than a multifamily house in your community, as Alli showed, this is a way to build consensus in a community for things that people can see and relate to. So it's a tested model, that a physical thing that they can see. And I know Jennifer and her group at Liberty House Plans have even done 3D models of these. So you can lay them out on the block to see kind of how that looks. And residents start to realize that they're not hung up on this term multifamily. They're not hung up on things that are unknown to them, like accessory dwelling units. They start to see lovable and livable places that are familiar to them. And then they can start to ask these deeper questions about how all the other pieces work. And I think finally, out of this process, this idea of providing higher quality. When we think about a national production builder, they have an army of folks that are going through to figuring out how to make a house very inexpensive, how to have the fewest amount of 2x4s in it, how to have it with the fewest amount of cuts and drywall. What are the marketing trends that need to occur to maximize house sales to meet the projection of 5 years from now? Pre-approved building plans bring that type of national effort down to the most local level in your community. This provides a lower bar of entry, an easier access point for folks that want to make this investment, whether they want to be called an incremental developer, whether they want to add an addition to their lot or build something next to them for a family member. This allows for that bar of entry because you have now taken a lot of the brain damage out where folks aren't trying to figure out whether or not you have to have a front porch or which department to go to. We can actually focus on higher quality design. And for communities across the country that want to add more regulation and requirements on the building, this is a great trade-off. If you want to do the next level of fire protection or the next level of environmental standard that adds costs to construction, we can save costs by finding house plans that we know are buildable, that we know can be streamlined through a process, and we know that they'll be liked by the neighbors in a streamlined approach. So as we go around, there may not be this bright sunshine that we can point and say, this city is doing it exactly well, and they've got house plans coming out. But if you think about this approach, any one of these three things of aligning City Hall, moving towards addressing and responding to a housing crisis in your community, empowering the community so they can be more familiar with these house types, so they get a built environment that is familiar to them, and then getting higher quality work out of these so that we see more things that are like what's already there or better, which is in our community, which again makes it easier for other development to come through. I would recommend folks at any level within your community to target just one of those, because this program through pre-approved house plans is a mechanism to open those conversations. So those are my thoughts, Rob. I'll hand it back over to you. I see a lot of lively questions and comments in the chat.
Rob, you are muted.
Oh, sorry. Yes, we're getting quite a few questions in the Q&A, and some of them are being answered, but we'll want to answer some of those for everybody. And in the meantime, so please ask your questions in the Q&A. Continue to ask those, and in the meantime, we'll talk a bit as a panel, and we'll then get to the Q&A.
We've also got a wide number of questions in our chat box too. And I think one of the big themes we're seeing there is the challenge of licensing in single family homes and ADUs relative to IBC buildings that require stamps, which I know is something we talked about a lot on our prep calls and have not yet gotten to in our conversations.
So, if you actually have asked it in the chat, please actually put it into the Q&A function of Zoom so that those questions aren't missed. But the first thing I wanted to put forward to you three is that there are so many ideas to address the housing crisis right now. And I mean, if you ask 100 people, you'll probably get 100 different answers of what's the solution to getting more housing, what's the solution to the housing crisis. But this idea of pre-approved building plans really does seem to stick out. A lot of people are latching on to this. So my question is, why is this particular idea so appealing now?
You know, as we talked about earlier, I think I'm the I think I might be the challenges view on these programs. I think right now, in some ways, it feels like an easy solution, and it is a thing that can be a really helpful tool in the toolbox for municipalities. And we have not seen incredibly widespread housing numbers produced by these programs alone. They are an important tool along with lots of other changes. One of the things that I think it's really easy for people right now trying to solve this problem to jump into is technology, right? Building construction technology solutions. Everybody wants it to be shipping containers and prefab houses and like robot 3D printed houses, and in some way using technology and or programs like this to kind of solve the housing challenge. And I think it is an important tool. And the constraints on housing that we're seeing are largely zoning and code limitations. And so anytime we have one of these programs that is being used to help soften the impact of zoning, limiting the number of units that we can put into neighborhoods, on focusing on really eliminating kind of the single family prejudice that we see in cities, that 75% of most cities are still zoned single family only. And even when we see an ADU program overlaid on within those, you know, that we're doubling our density, we're probably a quarter off of, you know, what we need in real density. So in some ways, doubling our density may or may not be that helpful. And so the more that we're moving towards getting significantly loosened zoning requirements that these programs are helping with, right? That if you're building these houses we've pre-approved, you can build more of them. Then I think we've really got good potential on these kinds of programs. But I think it also, there is a risk for municipalities of passing an ADU ordinance, right, and passing a pre-reviewed plans program and feeling like they've solved the housing crisis. And so one thing that I want to say really, you know, kind of firmly is this is a tool in the toolbox. This is not a silver bullet. And there is not a silver bullet either.
This is really, oh, go ahead, Jen.
I was just going to say, I think one of the reasons that these programs are popular is they're politically neutral and they are quicker to implement and easier to implement than some of the structural problems we face, like increasing the cohort of contractors who could build, or reforming zoning so that it's so that it enables a more productive use of land. You know, this is a program that a city can, or a town can implement, can calibrate to the size of the town. You know, can have a big program or a small one, and can implement in the course of a single year, as opposed to other initiatives that would tackle the causes of our supply constraint, that are more embedded in culture and in issues that we can't fix right away.
And I think everybody needs to recognize that this is not the solution.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of municipalities are interested in this because this is a silver bullet.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to adjust my zoning code because I have an awarding pre-approved building plan set. I don't have to talk to bankers and deal with the financing issues in my community because I've adopted a pre-approved building program. And much like we see bright, shiny objects, whether it's the large arena or the small new road, it's easy for elected officials and communities to get behind this to say that we have solved the problem.
Mm-hmm.
You really need to be thinking about the pre-approved building program as a response to many struggles in your community. When we talk about the housing crisis, and it's not just affordable housing, there are really three areas, kind of batches of areas that need to be tackled. There's financing, there's regulations, and there's incremental building. Until we get all three of those aligned, we're still going to be in this struggle. But something like a pre-approved building program lowers the bar of entry, so it's not just this mystery of developers coming in and figuring out how to do this stuff. It's not just bankers around the table. It's not just builders that are doing these things. This starts a conversation at the most local level about housing. And it's a delivery process of housing. And it's amazing what a planner will learn about the state building code when they engage in this process.
What-
It's amazing to hear what happens when a fire marshal talks to a zoning person in relationship to this type of program. And the low bar of entry, the building codes allow for less regulation on a smaller unit. So many of these programs that have been successful are working below the numbers. So before you trigger something harder, figuring out where the level of chaos that you're able to operate within a community before you trigger a whole bunch of whistles. So that this type of program, don't think of it as a solution. There's a lot of work that goes into it. I think if we were to analyze all the programs that are out there today, they're all still in their infancy, but they've taken the most important first step of engaging in this conversation.
Okay, I'm going to get to the Q&A, but just one more question. One thing that I've heard from knowledgeable people is that plans that are pre-approved should be ready to build. And could you tell me what that would look like, and why are cities having such a hard time getting to actually that vision or that standard?
People are not as easy and predictable as we would like them to be, would be my short answer, right? One of the things about a lot of these programs and building permit review and construction and the entire housing process is it is implemented by people, lots of individual people. And the consistency that we're trying to get to can be very challenging if we're not recognizing that baseline. And, we talked about it a little bit with building in some amount of customization as being available within these stock plans and saying what that boundary is. It's the same thing in our experience with building permit reviewers, right? They are people just like the rest of us, right? And if we had to write the same paragraph description 10 times about something, we would write it 10 different ways every time we sat down to do it. And so without some really clear, well-led municipal goals and challenges and checklists, without some real top-down kind of standards by which we're all operating, it's challenging in any city that we've worked with or without one of these programs to really get down to any level of absolute consistency, just because it's being implemented by people on the ground.
It's not a fault of the plans. It's that we are asking officials to do something differently from how they always have done it, or have done it, for the duration of their careers or the last 5 or 10 years. And one way that cities become good at what they do is they develop standard operating procedures. So when you're asking people to change that, it doesn't always go smoothly the first time around. It takes real management work to get that done. First, to convince people that that change should be made and that they won't be penalized for doing this new and different thing.
But on that, as a follow-up to that, Eliza asked, isn't it true that inconsistent comments are one of the issues the pre-approved building plans are supposed to address? Is this a lack of leadership willing to commit, or is it or are these site-specific issues that are real issues that the reviewers are addressing when they continue to review?
In our experience, it's human inconsistency, right? That has to be built into the way that you're doing your program. I think that's one of the real challenges to getting to an actual pre-approved program is having a city say, we have fully reviewed this and we are okay with it, and we are no longer even allowed to make additional changes unless they're made through this specific program change, right? We are not making changes to these plans on a one-on-one basis. The building permit inspector is not even looking at the plans. We are looking at the site plan. Here's the person that reviews the site plan. Here's how they review it. Here's what they can look at. And that once you're using one of these plans, if you're within XYZ very clear parameters, we don't even review it. Because as soon as we start, and we see this even in any permitting that we do in any jurisdiction here, as soon as you start to have people look at a set of plans, they will always have comments. And so you have to remove that step from the process if you're using this set of plans. And the key to that is to have all of the review that you need happen on the front end as part of the design, that your wall sections are approved by everybody, that your eaves are approved, right? That they've really looked at the details, they understand what they're committing to, and all of those changes have been made as part of the design process. And that there's not any expectation that we can make some of these tweaks as we go down the line. So I think just designing that into a program is really on the cities to be able to implement in a structural way.
And this is a cultural thing within City Hall, because getting the plans, walking into City Hall in the morning, and there are communities around the country where you walk in, you pay your money for your plans, and you can walk out. You still have site inspections. You still have a building official that may not be as familiar with that is going to come out and look at your framing work and look at your electrical work and complain about something that was drawn and written and approved in the plans. We have to switch the culture within municipalities. If we want to address housing, we need to switch the culture from trying to penalize folks to figuring out collaboratively how to move forward and really understanding where those realms are. I'm doing work up in Medicine Hat in Alberta, Canada, and we're struggling. We're hearing the struggle on the street where the building officials have different interpretations from what the plan review is to what's out in the field. This is not unique to Medicine Hat. This is occurring across North America. So again, as a program, you can't give up once you have the plans done. You've got to go all the way through to the use and occupancy when everything is turned on and somebody moves into the house. And I am confident that that cultural shift can happen across North America, because there are cities that are on that path doing it today.
Matthew Petty asks, how do consumers pay for the plans in Spokane, and how many plans were originally intended for the rollout?
So we haven't launched yet, so we'll see how this works, but Liberty House Plans is going to do the fulfillment. So when a builder wants to use one of the plans that is pre-reviewed, then they will go to a Spokane specific webpage of the Liberty House Plans website. So that page will be for the Spokane collection. It might be password protected. We haven't decided that yet. But they'll go to that page, they will purchase the plan, and Liberty House Plans will deliver it. Were there other parts of the question that I didn't address?
Well, how many plans were originally intended in the rollout?
Originally, we planned for 5. And here's since we're speaking of challenges to these rollouts, I think there's a temptation for a municipality to think, we need to create the whole thing. This is sort of, if you're in software, this would be the waterfall approach as opposed to the agile approach. So we need to create the whole thing, and then we roll it out complete. So here's the whole menu of options. But you really only need to start with one plan. And with that one design, you'll solve 80% of the challenges that are inherent in implementing this kind of a program in your city. So Dean Gunderson is in the audience of this call, and so is Taylor Burbridge. Excuse me. They just came back from being presented an award, if I'm not mistaken, this afternoon. So they can correct me if I'm wrong, but we will launch with one. And then as the next one makes it through the review, we will add that to the collection, and so on and so forth, and learn as we go. Dean says, currently we acquired 5 designs, but we dropped 1 due to issues that might emerge due to a required IBC review. And we're moving forward with 2 duplexes and 2 townhouse models. And the IBC question, I've seen others refer to that. You can include plans that would be required to be built under IBC in a program. Spokane is choosing not to, but it is possible. It's a technical problem, not a philosophical problem, so that those problems can be solved. And I know that Spokane is that the planning department has gotten requests from at least one member of city council to include ADU plans as well in the future. So I'll look forward to seeing how we do with the program and if adding ADUs will also be a possibility.
Here's a philosophical question. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Rob,
and
can I hop in to answer? I think what has been a big question, kind of, phrased a few different ways, is this IRC versus IBC question, right? So IRC, International Residential Code, we can build anything up to 2 attached units. Townhouses are technically single family attached units because they're structurally independent and they have a firewall. So townhouses, absolute key to urban density in a lot of locations. We gave a whole InkDev talk about it. Duplexes, townhouses, ADUs, single family homes are one of the things that's easiest to include in these programs because they don't, in most states, require an architect stamp. One of the things that we've talked through with a municipality in California about a solution to trying to get more missing middle plans that would require a stamp into the program is to take more of a plans catalog approach, which is then going to be an architect owned program. So architects can submit a set of multifamily plans, and those could be of any size, right? That can be a triplex, that can be a 12plex. That they could be submitted into a centralized catalog with a standardized fee by which the architect is saying, we will review, this set of plans has been drawn, they're fully complete. We will review this set of plans on your specific site, confirm that it still meets all of the codes, and then we will stamp it for X number of fee. It's the same idea as the pre-reviewed plans, that we're not reinventing the wheel every time we build a building. We're taking a building that has been designed, it works, it's fine, it has structural, it has MEP, and then the architects are able to say how much it will cost them to review that building and make sure it works again for you and stamp it. And one of the things that we talked about is allowing architects to have a different number of what it would take them to do that, right? Which means you're going to have some multifamily buildings that an architect and their team can stamp for you again really cheaply. You're going to have some teams that are a little bit more expensive, and allowing some of that market fluctuation in cost, but that it's pre-negotiated with the city to be included in the catalog. You have to have a line item of what it costs. That some of this is also about helping people who aren't as experienced in development have better access to better design and also more clear pricing. And so by putting together a catalog of IBC buildings, they can still be stamped and we can still have an open price of what that costs, and the architect can still own it. And all the city is doing is putting together a catalog of buildings they would be happy to see. And it's really helping shorten that process. And functionally, that's the way a lot of multifamily housing gets developed, right? You've got multifamily developers that have packages of 5 to 15 buildings that they've built a lot of times. They've got them honed down. Site planning for them is really just Tetris of their building catalog on a site. And so we're really taking that production scale of multifamily housing and IBC buildings and trying to bring it to a smaller, more incremental, more local set of developers. And so there are ways to do that working within our existing set of laws and the way that we build buildings. An IBC catalog is just a little different product than the IRC catalog because we do need that extra level of review, stamp, and approval of final drawings.
Okay,
yeah,
so
it's
we've
not
got a
what
lot
it
of questions.
costs. Yeah, it's not what it costs. It's knowing what it costs. So
Yeah,
having the
great.
predictability there is something unique to this program. And a place like Groveland, Florida, which is a very small community outside of it, right in Central Florida, they found that they couldn't really lower all their permit fees. They cut everything and subsidized everything they could. But what they could do is they could issue a building permit without the plans. So what it allowed builders to do is to walk into City Hall, select what they want, walk out with an approval letter to then go get financing that they could then come in the next day with their financing and then pay their permit fee. And it wasn't, the builders did not ask for a lowering of a permit fee. They liked the predictability. They paid one fee and they didn't go through multiple rounds of reviews of unpredictability.
Okay, excuse. So we are at the 1 o'clock time, and we're going to continue to answer questions. We've got a ton of questions. I don't know if we'll get to all of them. We're going to try to. I wanted to get to a question by Kenneth because I think he was the first one to ask a question, but this is more of a philosophical thing, but he asked, isn't beauty in the eye of the beholder? And I think he was responding to something that Jen said, that housing is, certain designs are not a treat. I mean, how, pre-approved building plans is about quality of design. How do you decide that? How do you decide that these are really nice looking plans that the majority of people are not going to object to?
I'll let
Some,
Jennifer jump in.
yeah, yeah, I'll wade into this minefield. Some of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but there are known preferences that are common across all cultures. The neurologist Steven Pinker has spoken about those: preference for symmetry, proportion, a variety of other qualities that can be found in architecture, art, and other cultural fields. And here in the US, for instance, there's a distinct preference for traditional design. It has been said that up to 80% of Americans prefer it. So if you are trying to build as much housing as you can in a short period of time and maximize the acceptance in the community for this new housing and minimize the friction that NIMBYs might provide, it makes sense to go with design that has been proven and that there's been a lot of already built in your place and that people already know and love. You can get wild and crazy if you want to do custom work, but if you're trying to make a big difference across a broad sort of spectrum of the city, it's good to go with what's proven.
I mean, that makes sense. That you can have the innovative plans, but they're not going to go through this process. They'll go through the full approval process.
And Dean Gunderson commented, he's the planner in Spokane that I work most closely with on this program. They've consulted people. I mean, it's not just a, kind of a decision. And one of the groups they've consulted has been the Landmarks Commission, and they have criteria that they've developed over time, and they can apply the criteria and have applied the criteria to the designs that Spokane has chosen for their collection. And actually, in any city, that's a really good group to consult. Dean has mentioned that they have been really happy to see these designs because it's a really easy yes for them when they have to review a design and it conforms to the traditional styles of architecture that have been embraced by the city over time.
Well, I should mention that we're going to post a video of this on the CNU website tomorrow. And so if you have to peel off, you can see the remaining questions answered, when the video is posted. There were a lot of questions, I think, about pre-approved, pre-reviewed plans for larger buildings, multifamily, 6 to 20, maybe multifamily up to 6 units, maybe mixed use commercial buildings. Any comments on that? Or is this on the horizon?
I would say as stock plans, yes. You can have a stock plan that's larger sizes, probably not so much as pre-approved plans, because the larger the building gets, the less likely it is to fit on the standard lot sizes in a city. And of course, the more complicated it is, because it's likely to be, reviewed under the International Building Code. But as a stock plan, it can work. You can, builder can find a stock plan that's of, larger number of units, or that's mixed use, and run that through their the normal review process. And part of why that works is because usually these plans were developed for another client and built for that client. So, they've proven to be buildable in a particular place. Alli might have a different answer to that, though. I'd love to hear actually what that answer is.
I think as we talk about the kind of, and we had a question that I just answered in the kind of question Q&A as well about this, but the IBC IRC is not just how it stands, right? It's two totally different construction types, and they are very different standards, and they're very different details, and they're very different costs per square foot to build. And so part of the benefit of simultaneously approaching, right? We talked about how important zoning code reform is. We also really need to be talking about building code reform, which in many cases has to happen at the state or national level. We've seen some, so we've got home rule states and Dillon rule states. Home rule states mean that we can have municipalities like Texas, where you can implement your own changes to the building code on a municipal by municipal basis. Dillon rule states mean that you actually need to, at the state level, municipalities can't change their own codes at the local level, you have to change it at the state level. So we've seen some municipalities in home rule states that have adopted things like allowing 3 and 4 plexes to be built under IRC. I think that's Memphis specifically. We've got some Ohio cities that have looked at the same thing. And the benefit of that is you're making those buildings cheaper to build. In many cases, we're not seeing any actual significant quality differences. Often a 3 or 4 apartment building is going to be the same size as a big single family home, which can be built under IRC. So we're just saying we can have multiple people living in that same square footage. And so as we start to say, if we think of a really big house as being fine to be built under IRC, we don't have fire sprinklers, we're not requiring full MEP, right? We do need fire separation walls. Those details are really simple in most cases. That we can build that same square footage under that same construction type and be fine. And that doesn't just solve the stamping issue and allow programs like this. It also just realistically lowers the cost and complexity of building those buildings significantly. IRC contractors also tend to know and stick to their own details, right? Somebody who builds single family homes and townhouses and duplexes only builds that stuff, because the trades and details of an IBC building is just different. We got commercial contractors that build IBC buildings, residential contractors that build IRC buildings. So if you can start to open up 3 and 4 unit buildings to be built by residential contractors, their overhead is less, the details are simpler, our cost per square foot comes down significantly in almost every level. It's cheaper to design, it's cheaper to build, you open up a much wider pool of often locally owned contractors, right? Your painter can be the guy with the truck that lives down the street. You don't need the painting crew of they have 15 crews and 3 schedulers in the office and they only do commercial work. And so a lot of this is trying to get to, one of the reasons our housing is so expensive is that by code, it's so complicated to build, right? We've made everything except Cadillacs illegal, and then we wonder why all our cars are so expensive, is that analogy. And so the more that we can move buildings back to IRC, the more that is a totally proven, safe, lovely, frankly, still much higher quality way than we've ever built houses before. And we can start to get the same number of people living in the same mass of building, just smaller households and more little households tucked into that square footage, which is a long answer, but more or less it's cheaper in every single way to build an IRC building than an IBC building.
Our current code system is sort of like a regressive tax.
Yes.
It's cheapest to build a large single family home on a per square footage basis. It's a lot more expensive to build a 10,000 square foot building that will house 5 people than it is to build a 5 people in different households than it is to build a 10,000 square foot building that will hold 5 people in one household. And so what that does is it basically places a tax on small households living in more affordable sized units. So it's a big equity problem because it's a big affordability problem. And this would be a really good time for us to rationalize the codes. And by rationalize, I mean like make them rational so that we can address the housing crisis from that angle as well.
And I want to tuck in too an answer to we've seen lots of conversation in both the chat and the Q&A about Sears kit homes, right? And this is a problem that we solved as a product to the free market, solved this problem. The dates I saw in there were 1908 to 1940. And the things that we didn't have a lot of when that product was successful were building codes and zoning codes. And that product stopped being successful by the private market as we saw those codes be implemented. Cities have chosen to uphold these codes. Our zoning codes can be changed in any city here, generally with a vote by their elected officials. They could change their zoning code in one vote. Whether or not they actually would is different, as we found. Right, but there is local control complete over zoning. And so we could change that back tomorrow. Most cities aren't. But as we say, well, why can't we just have Sears kit homes again? This version of pre-reviewed programs is really the hack to say that can't be done by the private market anymore because we have so much regulation that is so misaligned to housing construction types, housing financing types, and the way that we actually house people. And so because we built ourselves into this completely skewed regulatory system around housing, we can't have a private company solve that anymore. Amazon has tried. Home Depot has tried. The private market can't solve this challenge in this way right now because of our regulations. Cities can then back into trying to do it because cities are in charge of the codes. So that's why all of these programs are a tool towards code reform, which is really ultimately what's needed.
What role has the community input played in plan selection? Lisa asks. And to that end, have you seen an example of a program that attaches plan options to specific neighborhoods or areas as a way to address context-sensitive design? I guess that's pattern zones. Edward, do you have an answer to that? What have you seen?
Yeah, I much like in the past, we talked about, CNU was very integral in this idea of pattern books. This is the same idea. And I think this is a very local discussion. So if there's a certain house, and we see it in master plan communities. So go look at any of the very best of the new urbanist communities. They've been coded for building typology. So where porches go, where front entries go, that's a hyper local thing that, yes, can be done. In South Bend and Kalamazoo, they've got in their plan sets the ability for you to go and do changes to the plans, much like you see in production building. So you can choose a right or a left. Maybe you don't want to pay for extra windows on the side of the house because you're close to another property. And as long as it doesn't trigger a code requirement, it's clearly identified within the plans, you can omit that. And that's again, in South Bend, they saw they needed more flexibility in the plans. Where can we be flexible? In Kalamazoo, they needed to put houses in areas that people were refusing to invest. So as though we were looking at a building thing, not only from a style standpoint, they're actually getting comps on the ground. They're setting the framework. And I saw a couple of questions out there too about, communities have adopted these, but nothing has been built out of that plan set. I do not see that as a failure. The idea that you were able to get accessory dwelling units approved and an acceptable structure within your community, I would not care if they picked the pre-approved plans the city did, or they went on the free market and found something or a builder architect to do it. The conversation probably prior to that, this is something that was unfamiliar to the community and would not have been built. So again, these are not going to be a direct result success stories, but things are moving in the system. Things are getting entangled in City Hall. Things are being more familiar in the community as a result of this conversation.
Somebody had actually asked about the fear of parking and thoughts on. I don't want to turn this into a conversation on parking because we could have a whole other program on that, and we have, and we will again. However, I guess it brings up the site design issue, and we've talked about how you also need site design approval for these pre-approved building. But I imagine, and I haven't looked all that closely at these, but you probably have certain plans that would go on certain size lots, and then there would be recommended configurations for things like parking and putting in a maybe a detached garage or an ADU or something like that. How does that work?
One of the things that I'm sad that I think this is really a core advice for anybody putting together one of these programs, and I'm sorry, we're just getting to it at 12:15, is that one of the things that's most key about creating a Tetris piece box is you need pieces of lots of different proportions, right? So you need some long and skinny houses, and you need some more square houses, and you need some L-shaped houses, and that you need more variety in footprint than you need variety in product. And that lets you really Tetris around. We saw kind of a question about it, existing big trees. Giving different proportions of footprint is the thing that really helps make a wide variety of these houses applicable on a wide variety of lots. And I think it's important for us when we talk about parking to recognize that we work with a lot of big multifamily developers. And one of the things that they have found doing parking counts on their own properties, trying to be able to justify building less parking than standards often require, is that when they do parking counts of their own properties that are fully occupied, they know how many bedrooms there are, they know how many are leased, and they go through at different times of day, different days of week, right? And they make the interns count how many cars are there. They find really consistently that the most parking that they ever find on site is about 0.75 cars per unit. Most of these are 1-bedroom units. There are some 2-bedroom, but generally what we're finding is that's a really consistent, even in a very suburban location. Everybody's not home all the time. Somebody's always at the airport. Somebody's staying over at their girlfriend's house. Somebody's out of town. Somebody's at work. And so there is this cost of parking that we've placed on housing to say that not only do you have to afford the more expensive house to build, not only do you have to afford more land so that we have all these setbacks, you also now have to be able to afford more land and the cost of paving for parking, whether or not you want a car. And as we look at historic neighborhoods that have a lot of this missing middle housing, a lot of it has no parking whatsoever, even in not very walkable locations. And that has often worked in these historic neighborhoods for 50 to 200 years. And so as we start to say, providing people more options via loosening codes doesn't mean no one needs a car and doesn't mean no one's allowed to have a car. It's saying, let us design the housing and the amount of parking for that housing that is going to work for the tenants in that housing. And that has wide variety. We are going to have different streets that have more and less on-street parking. We're going to have households that have more and less cars, right? If we have households that are over 55, our car usage goes down by about 50%. As we start to look at low-income households, our car usage goes down by about 60%. And so the more that we can tailor price point and car need to parking, the more that we can actually start to provide housing that is more responsive in terms of cost, location, and density to the actual needs of the people living in it.
Right.
And-
It's an issue that's separate from pre-approved plans. Is the issue occurs regardless of how you're going to build that, choose your design for your house. But one way that it does intersect is if you're choosing designs to be part of your pre-approved plan collection, you want to choose designs that will fit on a typical lot for your community. In Spokane's case, that's 50-foot wide lot, and still allow for the parking provisions that are required in that community, which actually in Spokane, they've suspended the on-site parking requirements, if I'm not mistaken. But, if a community hasn't done that, then, you can catalog the typical lot sizes in your community and choose designs whose width, whose frontage meets the conditions that you expect a builder to have to fulfill in in that place.
Otherwise, it's
And
not buildable.
on the site design stuff, we've gotten way too complicated. The planners have way too much authority on this. When we think about the things of a building, I've worked in lots of places. The key elements from a zoning standpoint is making sure it fits on the lot. So whatever the side setbacks are, whatever the front setback. But when it comes to grading, there's lots of regulation in the building code that deal with the most fundamental issue of site, and that's to get water away from the building. If we can get the planners out of this so that they understand that they can trust the builder, trust the building department when they look at the building site and they do the foundation work, that water is going to shed away at a slope that's not going to flood a neighbor, and that parking can be a little bit, we can almost eyeball it. If you don't want it in the front of the house, then you make it so the buildings are pushed up to the street so you can't get parking in front of the house. That alone would expedite and lower enormous amounts of cost. I just can't tell you how many cities I go to that they require an engineer to sign and seal a house plan to make sure that the site works. And that just adds unreasonable cost and complexity to this system.
That would really be a cultural change. Andrew asks, how effective do you believe a pre-approved housing program can be in generating new housing construction and investment in core lower income urban areas that have experienced decades of disinvestment, all within the city regional market that is stagnant or declining?
I think it's huge.
Yeah.
Now, it's not an alone system. You just don't adopt the program and all of a sudden it arrives. And if you want to see how affordability is working with this, Kalamazoo, Michigan is the one that comes to mind for me because their pre-approved plans were only eligible for not-for-profit builders. So their first run of that. You have to work with the local municipality on this type of house building on all levels. It's not just the regulation and making sure the house looks pretty. It's got to be the right unit type that matches the folks that are going to be housed there. So why would you like on YouTube, the Mr. Big, you're not going to give a high school kid a jet as an award. We've got to make sure that it works within the structure so it's right sized for the family unit. But you also have to work on the financing of it. It's extreme that a HUD form on any new development is extremely powerful for a community to make sure that the true value and expense of building that house in those areas is recorded so that you have comps to support the wealth generation in those communities that will also attract other builders that maybe want to build something different than what the house plans are that the city is providing. But I think it is a very powerful tool in those neighborhoods.
Oftentimes the
We can
concern
actually
in that.
send, we can send some of the rest of these questions that we haven't gotten to around, and maybe we can, I don't know, if folks want to email me, I'll put my email in the chat, and I could distribute some questions around that haven't been answered. But in the meantime, do any of you have any final comments on this? Just wrap things up.
Let me close with a couple of thoughts. I want everybody leaving this to know that we're in the infancy of the pre-approved building plan phase. We had a model of this that worked, and we've talked about that Sears plan, and our modern development pattern has put us in a position where this seems strange, new, and unfamiliar. There's lots of moving pieces to it. And if your community is having this type of conversation, and clearly there's interest in it across North America, continue to have that. I know the work that Allie's doing and the work that Jennifer's doing is positively impacting communities and changing the way the cities are seeing this move forward. I would get in touch with folks like that. And there's a long list of folks that are out there doing pre-approved building plans. You need to talk to both the municipalities that have adopted the programs to do better than what they did, and talk to the professionals doing this to learn where their best practices are, because this is an exciting opportunity to address a housing struggle in all of our communities.
Thoughts, Alli or Jen? Any final
I'll
thoughts?
stand on what Edward said.
I hate to kind of end on not a really positive note, but also I want to end with a note of limitation of this as the only solution and a real encouragement to everybody to be thinking about how broad the changes are that are needed to our housing market before we're going to see big changes. And this is such an important step towards getting more missing middle housing, more small unit housing, more non-typical development, especially incremental development into cities. And we've seen some incredible work from kind of repeated plans. We've got IncDev Krouse been working for a long time in places like Kalamazoo and in South Bend and, in Memphis. And we've seen some really great work come out of that at a variety of price points. And we didn't even get into financing, right? Until kind of Ed's final comments. And yes, if we don't have a way to finance these programs for the actual small and local developers who want to build them, it's not helpful to have the plans in place. And so I think the big picture takeaway for me is this is such a great tool that people are really excited about right now. And we can make repeat designs that can be really useful to people, much more accessible, and with a much more regularized and open cost. There are so many ways for us to do that. And that's a really important and wonderful way to be helping improve the quality and diversity of our housing. And we have so much other work that we need to be doing simultaneously to really make these programs part of a bigger picture change.
I take it back. I will make a closing comment. Somebody asked about using these to address housing in neighborhoods that have seen disinvestment. And that's, essentially a question about what do we do when the market doesn't support new construction. And what I will say is that there's no silver bullet, but there is potential. And that if there's interest in that question, I think we might choose to do maybe not a on the park bench about it, but I'd be happy to host a session, a webinar on that, if Rob decides it's sort of outside of his editorial calendar, because I think there's a lot that can be said about it, and that pre-approved plan collections could be one part of the equation for that.
Okay, with that, I'm going to thank you three for being part of this. It's really excellent content on this webinar, and I want to thank everybody who attended. We had a really good turnout. Everybody, I will see you again on the park bench in a future webinar. Thank you.